Welcome to the store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
The sky had turned a menacing shade of gray, the kind that pressed down on the battlefield, choking the life out of the ground and filling the air with an ominous hum. Mark crouched behind a half-crumbling wall, its stone pitted and scarred from the countless skirmishes that had plagued this land. Lightning cracked across the horizon, illuminating the scattered bodies of soldiers, both human and elven. The elves had always had the advantage with their alliance with the storm giants, beings of ancient power who commanded the elements like playthings. The human army, on the other hand, was fighting a losing war, barely hanging on to scraps of land, inching backward day by day. Mark gritted his teeth as the wind picked up, howling through the battlefield. He had seen too many comrades fall to the elves' mastery of magic. It wasn't just the speed and skill of their warriors, it was their ability to call down the wrath of nature itself. Whenever the elven forces appeared, so did the storm, and it was merciless. Entire human battalions had been swept away by floods or torn apart by winds so fierce they could flay a man's skin from his bones. Today was no different. Rain poured down in thick sheets, hammering the earth and turning it into a quagmire. Mark felt helpless, as he always did in these moments. He had his sword, his training, and his courage, but none of that could stand against the full force of nature. In the distance, he could see the elven lines forming, their banners whipping in the wind. The battle would begin soon, and the humans were ill-prepared. A ragged breath escaped him as he scanned the sky, his eyes tracing the swirling clouds. "What hope do we have against the storm?" muttered one of the soldiers beside him, his voice barely audible over the wind. Mark didn't answer. There was no point in giving false hope. The truth was, without a miracle, they were all going to die. The signal to charge came from the human general, a short blast from a war horn that was quickly drowned out by the roar of thunder. Mark rose with the rest of his unit, slipping in the mud as they moved toward the elven army. He gripped his sword tightly, feeling the weight of it, knowing it might be the last time he wielded it. As they drew closer, the wind intensified, buffeting them from all sides. Some men were knocked off their feet, others were blinded by the rain. And then the elves came, moving like shadows through the storm, their blades flashing with deadly precision. Mark ducked under a swing, deflecting an elven sword and countering with a thrust of his own. His blade found flesh, and the elf crumpled to the ground. But for every one he struck down, there were more, and they fought with an unearthly grace, their movements fluid and precise, like water. A flash of lightning split the sky, and in that moment, Mark saw it, a figure at the edge of the battlefield, barely visible through the rain. It was an old man, hunched and cloaked, standing at the entrance of a cave that Mark had never noticed before. Something about the man's presence felt unnatural. Mark wasn't sure what drove him, but before he realized what he was doing, he had broken away from the battle, moving toward the cave. The wind seemed to guide him, pushing him forward, and as he drew closer, the old man disappeared into the darkness of the cave. Mark hesitated for a moment at the entrance, but the sounds of battle behind him spurred him onward. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something ancient. The cave walls were etched with symbols that Mark couldn't read, but he felt their meaning in his bones. This was no ordinary place. In the center of the cave, resting on a pedestal of stone, was the artifact. It was a crystal, larger than his fist, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to pulse in time with the storm outside. Mark approached it cautiously, his heart racing. The old man was nowhere to be seen, but Mark knew that this was what he had been led here to find. Without thinking, he reached out and touched the crystal. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, a shock ran through him, and he felt the storm, the power of it, the wild, untamable fury of the wind and lightning. It surged through him, filling him with energy, and for a moment, he felt as though he might be torn apart by it. But then something shifted. The energy flowed into him, through him, and he realized that he could control it. He could bend the storm to his will. Mark stumbled back from the pedestal, gasping for breath. The crystal still glowed faintly, but its power now thrummed within him. He could feel it coursing through his veins, and with it came a realization: this was the key. This was how he could turn the tide of the war. He emerged from the cave just as the storm began to abate, the rain slowing to a drizzle. The battlefield was littered with bodies, both human and elven. The battle had raged on without him, and it seemed as though the humans were on the verge of defeat. But Mark wasn't the same man who had entered that cave. He raised his hand, and the air around him crackled with energy. The storm responded to his call. The sky darkened once more, but this time, the storm was his. He could feel the wind at his fingertips, the lightning sparking just beneath his skin. He raised his sword and summoned the full force of the storm, directing it toward the elven lines. The elves, who had once wielded the storm as their greatest weapon, faltered as the winds turned against them. Lightning crashed down, striking their ranks, while the wind tore through their formations. The human soldiers, emboldened by the sudden shift in the weather, charged forward with renewed vigor, cutting through the elves like a scythe through wheat. Mark stood at the center of it all, his sword raised high, directing the storm with a thought. He felt invincible, as though he had become one with the very elements themselves. The elves had no answer for it. Their magic faltered, their warriors fell, and soon, they were in full retreat. As the last of the elves fled the battlefield, Mark lowered his hand, and the storm began to dissipate. The rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the clouds parted, revealing a sky painted with the colors of a setting sun. The battle was over. The humans had won, but as the adrenaline began to fade, Mark felt the weight of the artifact's power pressing down on him. It wasn't just the physical toll, though he felt utterly drained, but something deeper. The storm's energy had become a part of him, and he knew that it was not something that could easily be controlled. The artifact had given him power, but it had also changed him. Mark stood at the edge of the battlefield, feeling the lingering tension of the storm within him. The skies above had calmed, but the power remained. It thrummed through his veins, subtle now but ever-present, like a second heartbeat. The remnants of the human army cheered behind him, their voices rising in jubilation as they realized what had happened. The elven forces had been routed, their strongest weapon, the storm, turned against them by the very man who had once cowered beneath its might. But Mark felt no elation, only a quiet sense of unease. He knew that what had just transpired was more than a simple victory. The artifact had granted him unimaginable power, but it came at a cost. Already, he could feel its pull, as if the storm itself wanted to remain in motion, to never cease its fury. Controlling it had taken everything he had, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. General Kale approached, his face dirted from battle but alight with hope. The grizzled commander clasped Mark's shoulder with a firm grip, his voice rough with exhaustion but brimming with admiration. "You did it, Mark. By the gods, you turned the storm against them. We've won." Mark nodded, forcing a smile. "For now, we've won," he said, his voice distant. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the elven forces had disappeared into the dense forests beyond the plains. "But the elves will return. They won't give up so easily." Kale followed his gaze, his expression sobering. "Aye, they will. But with you by our side, we stand a chance now. Whatever power you've harnessed, it saved us." Mark didn't respond immediately. His hand tightened on the hilt of his sword as he looked down at the ground beneath his feet, still soft and wet from the storm. The artifact's power had saved them today, but Mark knew better than anyone that it was not his power, it belonged to the storm. And the storm was not easily tamed. That night, while the soldiers celebrated their hard-won victory around makeshift fires, Mark stood alone on a hill overlooking the camp. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The artifact, now bound to him, pulsed faintly with energy, glowing softly beneath his armor. Every so often, he could feel it tugging at him, a subtle reminder of the power that lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. That he knew he needed to understand it better, to master it fully before it mastered him. But how? The artifact's power was ancient, older than the elves and the humans combined. Whatever magic had created it was beyond his comprehension. All he knew was that it had been hidden for a reason, sealed away in that forgotten temple, waiting for someone like him to find it. As the days passed, Mark threw himself into studying the artifact, seeking any means to control its power without losing himself in the process. He practiced in secret, away from the prying eyes of the soldiers and the other commanders, pushing the limits of what the storm could do. At first, the power was wild, unpredictable, threatening to consume him with every strike of lightning or gust of wind. But gradually, he learned to harness it, to bend it to his will without being overwhelmed. Yet with each passing day, he could feel the strain it placed on him. The more he used the artifact, the more it took from him. His body ached constantly, his muscles fatigued in ways that no amount of rest could alleviate. Worse still, he began to hear whispers, faint, indistinct voices carried on the wind, speaking in a language he didn't understand. The artifact was changing him, in ways he couldn't fully grasp. And then the nightmares began. Each night, Mark would dream of storms, vast, endless tempests that stretched across the horizon, consuming everything in their path. He would stand in the eye of the storm, watching helplessly as it tore through cities and villages, its winds uprooting trees and buildings, its lightning setting fire to the land. In these dreams, he was no longer in control. The storm raged on, indifferent to his will, unstoppable. He would wake in a cold sweat, the whispers louder now, clearer. They spoke of power, of dominance over nature, of becoming one with the storm. But they also spoke of destruction, of chaos, of the futility of trying to control something that was never meant to be controlled. Mark knew that he was approaching a crossroads. The artifact's power was vast, but it was not meant for a mortal man. If he continued to use it, if he allowed it to become a part of him, he risked losing himself entirely. But if he gave it up, the human army would lose its greatest advantage, and the elves would return with a vengeance. The decision weighed heavily on him, but the choice was soon made for him. It was at dawn, 3 weeks after the battle, when the scouts returned with grim news. The elven forces were regrouping, and they were bringing reinforcements. Thousands of elven warriors, led by the storm giants themselves, were marching toward the human stronghold. The final battle was coming, and this time, there would be no retreat. Mark knew what he had to do. As the human army prepared for what they believed would be their last stand, Mark stood at the center of the camp, surrounded by his men. They looked to him not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of hope. He could see it in their eyes, the belief that with him and the storm on their side, they might just survive this. But Mark no longer felt that certainty. He had come to understand that the storm was not a tool to be wielded, but a force of nature, unpredictable and wild. And yet, he had no choice. He had to use it one last time. When the elven army arrived, they brought the full fury of their magic. The sky darkened as the storm giants summoned their own tempests, hurling lightning and rain down upon the human fortifications. The winds howled, and the ground shook beneath the force of their assault. Mark stepped forward, raising his hand to the sky. The artifact glowed with a blinding light as he called upon the storm, his body trembling with the strain of controlling such immense power. The wind answered his call, swirling around him in a violent vortex. Lightning crackled at his fingertips as the storm grew, matching the fury of the elves. The two storms collided in the sky above the battlefield, a violent clash of elemental forces that shook the earth. The human soldiers watched in awe as Mark stood at the center of it all, his figure barely visible through the swirling winds and rain, but Mark could feel the strain. The artifact was pushing him beyond his limits, drawing more and more power from him with every passing moment. The whispers were louder now, insistent, demanding. He could feel his control slipping, the storm pulling him deeper into its chaotic embrace, and then, in a single, terrible moment, Mark realized the truth: the storm was not meant to be controlled. It never had been. The artifact had given him the illusion of power, but it was the storm itself that had been using him. It was a force of nature, and no mortal man could ever hope to command it. With a final burst of energy, Mark released his grip on the artifact. The storm surged one last time, a blinding flash of lightning splitting the sky and striking the heart of the elven army. The storm giants fell, their bodies crumbling to dust as the power of the storm consumed them, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm was gone. The battlefield was eerily quiet in its aftermath. The elven forces had been decimated, their strongest warriors defeated. The human army stood victorious, but there was no celebration. The cost had been too great. Mark lay on the ground, the artifact cold and lifeless beside him. He could feel the storm's power fading from his body, leaving him weak and exhausted. But he was at peace. He had done what needed to be done. As the surviving soldiers gathered around him, Mark looked up at the sky, now clear and calm. The storm was gone, but its memory lingered. He had been its hero, if only for a moment.